Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantir Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantir Me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas satbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Shanti 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 Harihi Om.
Good morning. We'll sing a song to Buddha on the last page of the book.
Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Today we celebrate the birthday of Buddha according to the lunar calendar. It was yesterday. This is also called, as many of you are aware, as the thrice blessed day. So he was said to have been born on this day. He attained enlightenment on this day, and he also passed away. The day of his passing in the Buddhist tradition is known as Mahaparinirvana Day. So all the three important events in his life occurred on this day. Now, over the years, we have celebrated these birthdays of these great ones, and we sometimes do it by remembering incidents from their lives. We sometimes do it by remembering their teachings, and sometimes both. And that's more or less how we do things when we remember people who have gone by. Even our own contemporaries who may have passed on. We try to remember people whom we have known. Sometimes we do that by remembering incidents from their life, some of the incident that we were connected with possibly, or some of the words that we have heard them say. Now when we look at the lives of especially these great teachers of the past, we see that their lives and their teachings are connected. In fact, that is the hallmark of every authentic life. What makes a life authentic? Life becomes authentic if one's words, one's actions are an expression of the inner person. So the outer persona that is visible to the world and the inner being that is visible only to the person concerned, the less the gap between these two, the more authentic and life is. And one of the characteristics, especially of these great teachers whom we today see as prophets, as saviors, as incarnations, was that their outer persona and their inner life, there was no difference at all. Their lives were completely authentic. So what they said was truly an expression of who they were. They lived what they taught. So when we look at their teachings, and sometimes are not able to figure out what a particular teaching meant, all that we need to do is just look at their life. You look at the life of Jesus, of Buddha, Ramakrishna, all of these great teachers. If some of their words are not clear to us, we just have to look at their life. And oftentimes we see that their lives are the best commentaries on their teachings. And that also gives us a chance to look at our own lives. All of us have had many different kinds of experiences in our life, but how many of us have learned from our experiences? In fact, that's what makes one person different from another. Why do we see people are different? It's not simply because they have had different experiences in their lives, but because they have not learned in an equal way from everything that happened in their lives. And so one of the things this kind of a reflection gives us an opportunity is to look at our own lives and see that among all these many varied experiences I have had, which of these experiences I have truly digested. And digesting experiences in our lives means learning from them. It also means not repeating the errors of our past. So we all make mistakes, everyone makes mistakes, but all that we need to see is how many of my mistakes are truly original, or how many of my mistakes are being recycled again and again and again. So every time I repeat a mistake, it means I've not learned from my past mistake. And so that's the second thing to keep in mind. So today what we'll try to do very briefly is look at some of the experiences that the Buddha had and see that how they led to the teachings that eventually came from him. The first formative experience in Buddha's life is well known to all of us who have read his life. The three great sights that he saw. Now the Buddha, as was the custom of his days, he was born in a royal family. He was a prince, and as was customary in those days, he had learned. He was taught everything. He had the best teachers to not only teach him about weapons and fighting, because that's what a Kshatriya was supposed to do, but also some of the best pandits came and taught him. The Upanishads, the Gita, all that the Buddha studied. In fact, some of the great scholars in the Vedantic tradition did not come from the priestly class. Some of the scholars were really from the Kshatriya. If we just compartmentalize them, they're supposed to be the warrior caste. But if we look at the Upanishads, many of them, King Janaka, for instance, was not a Brahmin, was not a priest. He was considered as one of the enlightened beings, and he taught others. So Buddha had all that training. But one rather unusual feature of his life was that he was not allowed to leave his palace for a long time. And the reason for that, we read in his life, was that as soon as he was born, when the royal astrologers were called and they saw, after seeing the way they dropped the horoscope, they came to this conclusion, and that's what they told Buddha. His name was Siddhartha when he was born. So they told Siddhartha's father, the king, that this young prince who is born, there are two possibilities. He might either become one of the greatest kings of his time, or by being disgusted by the nature of the world, by being disillusioned by the suffering in this world, he may not want to rule the world at all. He may just give it up and become an ascetic, go to the forest and become a monk. Now clearly the king didn't want him to go away and wanted him to inherit the kingdom after him. And so he said, well, if his mind is going to turn to ascetic life after coming in contact with the sufferings of this world, then I will do all I can so that this prince never gets to see any suffering. That's difficult for us. Every time we just go out into the street, there is a lot we can see. But for a king, it was possible to do. So he made all the provisions so this little prince didn't have to leave the palace at all. And we read in his life that even his attendants were given strict instruction that you should always be smiling, always be cheerful. If any day you don't feel well or not good, don't come. Take a leave, paid leave that day, but don't come. So this is what we read, that all through for the first 16, 17, 18 years of his life, he didn't stir out of the palace, didn't know what suffering was. But of course, you can't keep someone locked up all through. Now when he has become, he's grown up, so he one day then tells his charioteer, I want to go out for a ride into the city. And the charioteer then takes him out of there. That was the first time you're stepping out of the palace. And while he saw many things, of course, when he went out into the streets, there are three sights that specially caught his attention. The first sight we see was that he saw a person was bent and walking with a stick, supporting himself and walking. And the Buddha, who had until that point never known that there's such a thing as old age, because all along everyone around him was meant to be always young and smiling. So he said, what happened? Why is that person walking with a stick? Why is that person doesn't seem to walk straight? And then the charioteer said, oh prince, well that's got old age. When people become old, the vigor and strength of youth departs, and then sometimes with age people bend. And the Buddha then, Siddhartha noticed that and just kept quiet. Then when they went further, he saw someone sitting under a tree, and this person was sneezing and coughing and really seemed in very bad shape. The Buddha had never seen sickness before that, and so I keep on saying Buddha, Siddhartha. And then, so he asked the charioteer, what happened? And the charioteer said, oh, prince, this is called sickness. People now and then fall sick and blah, blah, blah. And then the prince notices that and he keeps quiet. And then they go further still, and then they see someone being carried, two people on a kind of instantly made stretcher, carrying a person. And the Buddha said, why is that person asleep? And why are they carrying him like that? And then the charioteer said, oh prince, well that person is not asleep. That person is dead. He's never going to wake up again. And then the Buddha kept quiet. And then after a while, it seems, we read that Buddha said, okay, now take a U-turn, let's go back. Now, we all encounter these things in our lives. We don't even have to go out into the street today. Just go on the internet or read papers or watch your television. We know these things exist. But these things made a deep impression on the Buddha's case, because he looked at that experience and didn't allow it to sink in. And because he was a careful observer, he noticed that this suffering, he was very smart enough, intelligent enough, wise enough to know that suffering is of various levels. that there is one suffering which is related to the body and mind, of course, which is what he had seen today, that day, about sickness, aging, death, and there was suffering related to the mind, the stress and anxiety that people had. But then he didn't stop at that, because his mind then said, but there is suffering related to the existence as human beings itself. Because as a human being, well, I have a human body, but that's why I'm a human being. Or as a living being, I have a body and I have a mind. And all of these things that he saw today were related to the body and mind. And so as long as the body and mind are there, as long as I'm living, I cannot be free from these kind of sufferings. And so he therefore saw these two levels of suffering. Suffering related to just the body and mind, and which could be in terms of hunger, thirst, poverty. Now if Buddha did, of course, during that trip outside, had seen poor people, there were poor people in his kingdom, but that didn't bother him so much, because he knew if it was just a question of poverty or homelessness or hunger, there were some solutions to that. They may not be perfect solutions, may not be permanent solutions, but there was something he could do. His dad was a king, he could have instituted some socio-economic reforms, tried to alleviate hunger in some form, did something. But the things that he saw, there was really nothing he could do. There was no solution for the problem of aging, the problem of death, for the problem of sickness. And so those existential forms of suffering, suffering associated with very existence as living beings, he said he needed a different approach. And that's why we see in Buddha's life that in spite of the training he had had, both textual training, he had studied the Upanishad, studied the Gita, plus the training as a prince in weaponry and all of that, he found none of those things were helpful in actually solving this basic problem. Merely reading books is not enough. Merely being inspired by reading is not enough. We must do something about it. And that's why Buddha's approach was so practical. He said we need to go to the root of the problem. It's not enough, and we know in medicine it's not enough to merely treat the symptoms. We have to go to the root of the problem. And Buddha, Siddhartha, looked deep inside the problem and he zeroed in on desire. He called it tanha. That the desire, this longing, this feeling of inadequateness, feeling of incompleteness is at the root of all problem. And as long as that is there, we cannot be free from this pain and suffering. And because of this practical approach, his teachings are not theoretical. Eventually, when you actually read the Buddha's words themselves, they're intensely practical. Now, eventually, a very intricate theological structure did evolve, the Buddhist philosophy, what we call today. But Buddha was not a philosopher in that sense. Buddha, for that matter, most of these great prophets and incarnates, their words are the very simplest. Look at the parables of Jesus, the stories that the Buddha told, the simple teachings of Ramakrishna in the gospel. We see that their words are very direct, very simple, very straightforward. And eventually, those who come later then develop a conceptual framework around those words. Swami Vivekananda said that this is what the Buddha, he kind of paraphrased Buddha's teachings in these words. So he said, this is what Buddha said. Believe not because some old manuscripts are produced. Believe not because it is your national belief, because you have been made to believe it from your childhood, but reason it all out. And after you have analyzed it, then if you find that it will do good to one and all, believe it, live up to it, and help others to live up to it. So it was not just he didn't want to have just believe in this or believe in that. He said, reason it out. Accept only what makes sense to you. Don't believe anything blindly. And that we see is one of the central approaches of Buddha to spiritual life. And then we read that he, of course, we know that after that he leaves home, his wife, he has a young baby, he leaves them in the middle of the night and leaves home and goes into the forest and joins a group of ascetics. Now, this particular group that he joined, and it seemed also to be a general practice of his time, that those who wanted to go forth in search of truth often led a very intense life of tapasya, austerities, great austerities. And so because that was the custom of his time, and also the group that he had joined were extreme austerities. And that's what the Buddha practiced for a long, long time. In fact, if we read the description that comes in those ancient biographies of Buddha, are really scary. They said this rib cage had become visible. His extremely emaciated body. It just bordered on self-torture. After having spent some time that way, Buddha quickly realized, no, this is not the way. Just torturing oneself is not the way. And so giving up that extreme form of austerities that the group of which he was a part were practicing, then he goes into a nearby village and receives as alms a bowl of milk and drinks. And then the word quickly spreads among the whole ascetic community. Oh, he is now fallen from the path. He has drunk milk. So no hope for him. And the Buddha is very calm because he has understood, no, that's not the way. And that's became the genesis of his teaching on the middle path. That doing extremes of either, extreme indulgence and extremes of self-torture. The extremes will not take us anywhere. I think musicians often understand this. Even in many stringed instruments, we need the right tension at which the strings need to be. If they are too slack, you don't get the right sound. If it's too tight, they snap apart. And so just in the same way, there is place for austerity in life. But we need to know that the balance between what constitutes indulgence and what constitutes self-torture. And we need to kind of walk that fine balance. And that is what Buddha called the middle path. Now that was not a new teaching per se, because centuries before that, we read already in the Gita, when Krishna teaches about, he says that one who sleeps too little, one who sleeps too much, one who eats too little, one who eats too much, and so on, cannot be a yogi. So this idea that one has to follow the moderation in everything, that was stressed by the Buddha. Later we see after he leaves this group of ascetics, then he is by himself. He then goes deep inside the forest and starts reflecting deeply on the reality of life. And that's when eventually what emerged from that reflection and meditation was the Four Noble Truths, which are a cardinal teaching in the Buddhist tradition. We read that on the full moon night, he sits under a tree, a Bodhi tree, and makes a firm resolve. I'm just going to sit here and not get up until I become enlightened. This Sanskrit verse is a beautiful Sanskrit biography of Buddha called Lalita Vistara. So this verse occurs in it. He says, Ihasane shushyatu me shariram Tvagasti mamsam pralayancha yatu aprapya bodhim bahukalpa durlabham naivasanat kayam ataschalishyate. Which means I'm now determined to sit on this place and not get up. I don't care if this whole body dries up. Shushyatu me shariram, the sharira may dry up. Tvak asti mamsam pralayancha yatu. And the skin, the bones and flesh may it all return to its elements. But aprapya bodhim bahukalpa durlabham, this enlightenment, which is so difficult to get, even through millions of births, until I get that, na eva asanat kayam ataha chalishyate. Asana, from this seat, my body will not move until I acquire that truth, until I get that truth, which is so difficult to get. So with that firm determination, he sits. And then we read that eventually, before the moon set and before the sun rose, the next morning he had been enlightened. Again, with this incident we see the importance of firm determination in life. Even as devotees, when we pursue a spiritual life, we do have a longing to see God, longing to realize God, longing to advance in our spiritual life. But what is the intensity of my longing? How strong is my determination? And that is one of the 4 very important steps in being a fit student of Vedanta. It comes in the last way. It's called mumukshutva, the longing for liberation. Sri Ramakrishna called it vyakulata, the intensity of longing for that divine being. That intensity varies from person to person. And that's what makes the difference between one spiritual seeker and another. What is the height of that intensity? How intense can that intensity get? There is a text called Vedanta Sara, I believe it's 16th or 17th century, written by Chidananda. So in that, he says that the upper limit of that intensity would be, he describes it as Deepta Shira Jalarashim Iva, that if a person's head is on fire, with what intensity, with what longing such a person would go in search of water. When I have that kind of intensity, I will realize God right now. I will have the vision of God right now. We know, if someone's head is on fire, you say, why don't you just have a meal and then afterwards we can take care of it later on. And you say, no. But as far as our meditation is concerned, we feel, I can take care of it later on. Even if I miss it one day, it doesn't really matter. And so that's what this intensity of longing really means. And the Buddha's life, through this incident, we know that because of that extreme intensity he had, that firm resolve that he made, he became enlightened. And that tree, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren of that tree are still there. If you go to India in a place called Bodh Gaya, you will find that, the original tree isn't there, but the descendants of that tree are still there on that spot. So after he becomes enlightened then, the Buddha then he gets up from that seat and starts walking. And he comes in the area, near Benares, there is a place called Sarnath. And so that was where the Buddha was before as an ascetic doing all his austerities. So he is now walking along that path. And the same group of ascetics with whom he had done all these austerities see him from a distance. And they were still under, he is fallen from the path. He is the one who drank milk. And so they are talking among themselves and they say that when he comes, we're just going to totally ignore him. We're not going to pay any attention to him. We should not honor this man who is fallen from the path of yoga. And so they just sit there, just determined to totally ignore him and insult him, humiliate him, sort of. And the Buddha, we read, the Buddha comes slowly, peacefully walking along that path. And as soon as he comes near, these people who had made such a firm resolve, they just get up and fall at his feet. It was not a conscious thing at all. And what we learn from this incident is the power of purity, the power of truth. That once that Swami Vivekananda once said, through purity and silence comes the word of power. And so this is what we see through the power of purity, the power of knowledge, invariably. And these are the very ascetics who become his first group of disciples. They ask to be taken as his students. There's another one interesting incident. In a lot of mythology developed out of many of these small incidents in Buddha's life. And one was this: because the Buddha decried all the rituals, because what he saw as a reformer in the Hindu tradition in which he was born was that people were doing a lot of rituals, but not holding on to the spirit. You see, every ritual is very powerful, very meaningful, only when it is done not just ritually, basically some movement of hands and feet and words, but when these are accompanied by the true spirit within, understanding the meaning of all those external activities, then the rituals become very powerful. They can be very transformative. But bereft of that, just doing external stuff, they lose all meaning. And I've often said, that's true, as much true about social rituals as well. Rituals are not simply something in religion. They occur all the time in social life as well. Now, saying thank you or shaking hands or saying good morning, well, that's a social ritual. When I say thank you with my heart filled with gratitude, that thank you is very powerful. That thank you it sounds different. On the other hand, well, we say thank you all the time. And how often are we really thinking like, oh, I'm really grateful to you? When you wish someone good morning, how often are we like, I really hope you have a good morning? It's just become just an empty ritual. Just as it can happen in social life, it can happen in spiritual life, religious life as well. So that's what the Buddha had seen, that all these big Vedic sacrifices and everything people were doing, only the external shell had remained, but the internal spirit had vanished. And so he said, stop all these rituals. Go to the heart of the matter. Look at what it really means. And so the story goes this way, that all of these offerings that are made in these Vedic fire sacrifices, you can say Indraya Swaha, Varunaya Swaha, and so on, all of these, the deities, all the citizens of celestial worlds, they actually get the offering, the offering you make into fire in some subtle form is go to these higher beings in celestial worlds. And so they kind of depend on all the rituals that human beings are doing. Now when the Buddha came and thousands of people became his followers, he became so powerful and he told people, stop all these meaningless rituals. So all the rituals stopped. And people in heaven are like, well, today our meals on wheels hasn't come. And so they were like, no, we are being deprived of our food. And so then they said, we must do something to go to the root of the matter. This man called Siddhartha, who's become now the Buddha, he has stopped all these rituals. So we must go and finish him off, take care of him. And so, and then because they are celestial worlds, they are smarter. So sometimes people who are smarter are more dangerous because they have more clever ways of doing terrible things. And so then these celestial beings then, they take a human form, they come down and they just don't go and just shoot him or kill him. It didn't work. things were very different in those days. So they go to him dressed as priests, and then they tell this Buddha, they said, we want to perform a very special kind of Vedic sacrifice. But the requirement for that sacrifice is that it can be done in a very pure spot, very clean spot. It can't be done anywhere. And we have searched everywhere, and now, because you are such a holy person, your heart is the purest spot on this planet. That's where we want to do the sacrifice, because with that Vedic sacrifice, the whole world will get the benefit. And the Buddha was so compassionate. So he said, absolutely. So then Buddha lay on the floor, and they arranged all the wood, because of fire sacrifice, arranged all the wood on his chest, and they lit fire to it, and they started making oblation. The idea was, well, of course, he's going to die. But he didn't. So they said, what? This is a fire and he's not dying. And so then they just took that wood and started beating him. Then all the bets were off. There were no rules were being followed then. They tried the kind of things people would do today. So just finish him off. Nothing worked. And Buddha was kind of smiling and looking at all these things they were doing. And afterward, the Buddha says, my friend, you are not going to succeed, because purity cannot be killed. Knowledge cannot be killed. Now, this is not to suggest that all of these things actually historically happened. So a lot of the myths, therefore, are not meant to, clearly they're different from history, but the message that these stories give, that message is very real. Because that message, it's meant to teach us the power of purity, the power of knowledge. So this truth that the Buddha discovered about desire being at the root of all suffering in life, that if we only look clearly and deeply, this would be so obvious to anyone. Then he said, why isn't it obvious to people? Something that I can see so clearly, why aren't other people able to see it? And then he said, that is because most people are trapped in the web of time, in the past, present, and future. Swami Vivekananda once said, time is but the method of our thinking. We are the eternal present tense. And we find this teaching emphasized again and again and again in the Buddha's teaching. He said, tomorrow is not yet here. Yesterday is gone. Let us focus on today, because that's the only time that we can truly live. And that's why in the Buddha's life and his teaching, we see the importance of being mindful, of living in the present moment. We know about an incident that occurred. In fact, it became the genesis of one of the important texts in the Buddhist tradition called the Lotus Sutra. And so the story is actually pretty simple. And the story is that every day the Buddha became, to just continue with the biographical part of a little bit, so Buddha's teaching was so powerful, he was an enlightened being, that hundreds and thousands of people became his students and disciples. Monasteries sprung up everywhere, all through the Indian subcontinent. And so the story goes that the Buddha would every day give a talk, a kind of a satsang like we have. And so the Buddha would come, would sit under a tree, and in the beginning at least, most of his congregation was really monastic. Eventually, of course, not everyone obviously could become monastics, but it began primarily as a monastic tradition. So we read in this particular incident that every morning Buddha would come, there'd be like 1,200 monks and 1,200 nuns would be just sitting in front of him, and he would speak with them. So that would be that day satsang. And so one day the Buddha comes, he sits in front, and all of them are waiting. Now he'll start teaching, and the Buddha doesn't say a word. It's total silence. And everyone is like, why isn't he speaking? What happened today? And then the Buddha very quietly just takes up one lotus in his hand and holds it up. And people are like, okay, but wow, what happened? Why isn't he saying? And why is he holding a lotus in his hand? And then some more people who want to be even more analytical, they said, why only one lotus? Why not two? Why not three? Why a red lotus? Why not a white one? And so all these thoughts are going on in the minds of the audience in front of him. And Buddha is not saying a word, he's simply holding the lotus. Then among all those 24,000 people in front of him, or 2,400, the number is immaterial, this is only one person. And that person's name is called Anathapindika. Again, the name is not important, but one of them, he just looks and he smiles. And we read that seeing Anathapindika smile, the Buddha smiles. So only two people, the rest are all wondering what happened, why a lotus and so on. Only one person smiles, seeing him smile, the Buddha smiles. And then Buddha says only one thing. Today, a great treasure was given by me to Anathapindika. And then he gets up and walks away. And everybody like, what? What treasure? What happened? And so now centuries later, people are still trying to interpret, like, what does this incident really mean? What did Buddha really give to that Anathapindika? What did that Anathapindika really understand? And books have been written, and it's a big literature in itself. One of the many ways we can understand this, in a rather simple way we can understand this incident, is that when someone holds up something in front of you, we are expected to see it clearly. And so when the Buddha held up that lotus in front of everyone, he wanted people to see it. But instead of seeing that, people were thinking about it. People like, why? Why is he not speaking? Why this one lotus? Why not two? Why a red one? Why not a big one? There were so many big lotuses I saw on the way today. So hundreds of different thoughts in the mind. People were not seeing what he held up. They were thinking. Now only one among them, this Anathapindika, was the only one who didn't think. He just saw. And when he saw the truth. And Buddha saw that he had seen, so Buddha was happy. That's why only two people smiled in the whole thing. And this is very important, that even as we go about our day-to-day activities, even though our eyes may be open, even though we may be awake, and we might think we are seeing things, actually no. What we are really seeing are the thoughts and the reactions in our mind about whatever it is that the senses are perceiving. And so, odd as it may sound, thinking is an obstruction to seeing. Now, thinking is not to say thinking is bad, but thinking and seeing are two different things. In fact, one way in Vedanta sometimes they point out is, my eyes are closed. When I open my eyes, whatever the smallest fraction of time you can think about, even millisecond is too big. So smallest fraction of time, when my eyes open, the very first thing I see is nothing but God. It's just divine being. But then that divine being gets covered because when I open my eyes, I say, oh, this is Sunday today, and then we are having the Satsang, and we are studying this, or now today it's a river, it's a beautiful weather. All these kind of thoughts, my identifying things. So for instance, now I look at a chair. If I just look at the chair, just look at it, I should see nothing but Brahman, nothing but God. But no, what I see now is, oh, it's a very comfortable chair, it's red in color. So all of the thoughts associated with the form of that, with the name, with the idea associated with it, obscure the reality of that thing. And so that's what the Buddha meant, that seeing means only seeing. And that's true with regard to our daily meditation as well. When we meditate, when we try to perceive the presence of God in our heart, Meditation is actually seeing God. Meditation is not thinking about God. Now, of course, if we close eyes and don't see God, we just see darkness, then the next best thing we can do is think about God. So thinking is useful, but thinking itself is not seeing. Now, what does happen, that if I can think intensely about God, excluding all other thoughts, if the only form in my consciousness remains the form of my chosen form of the way, whichever way I think about God, the only sound that I'm aware of is the sound of my prayer or the sound of my mantra, then eventually, unbeknownst to me, at some point, that thinking will stop on its own and seeing will begin. But the two things will not ever happen simultaneously. I cannot think and see at the same time. So I must see God. If I cannot, I must think about God. I must think about God so intensely to the exclusion of everything else that eventually thinking will stop and seeing will begin. And so that is what the Buddha meant when he said that being mindful really means just seeing. And if we can cultivate that habit, now it's not easy. We have to begin by small things. As simple a thing as brushing our teeth for matter. So every morning if I'm brushing my teeth, I might think, oh, that's not a task that needs a lot of concentration. And so while brushing my teeth, I'm planning about things that I need to do to the rest of the day. Now that's a bad habit. Bad habit because if while I'm brushing my teeth, I'm thinking of something else, my mind gets accustomed to thinking of something else while doing something else. And so then, suppose I think that, oh, at the time of brushing my teeth, I think, oh, I should now go and fix myself a cup of coffee. Then when I'm fixing myself a cup of coffee, I'm thinking, oh, now I must go and do something else. In other words, my mind is not where whatever it is I'm doing at that moment is. And the Buddha wanted to break that habit. And that's really what mindfulness means. With practice, no matter how often we fail, if I can focus my mind on the activity at hand, the thought in my mind, the quality of our thinking, the quality of our work, the quality of our interpersonal relationships, that quality will improve. And so this mindfulness practice is very, very, very helpful. Because if we are mindful, when we are mindful, life will appear very different to us. So once we learn to live with full awareness, then we acquire mental clarity. And with mental clarity, we acquire knowledge. The word that occurs in Buddhist books is called prajna. So once that knowledge comes, it's through that knowledge that karuna, or compassion, and love emerge. So all that we need is to be present, not get distracted, acquire that mental clarity, get knowledge, and love will automatically sprout in the heart. We don't have to make extra effort to become loving or to show our love. All that we need to do is to have a clear head, look at things clearly, acquire that knowledge, and become mindful. And finally, just to conclude, 4 major shifts occurred if you want to kind of categorize it, as a result of Buddha's advent. First was the shift from otherworldliness to here and now. A lot of times, spirituality and religion becomes very otherworldly. It's about, oh, what will happen to me after I die? Whether I go to heaven, or the fear of hell, or some kind of a post-mortem anxiety about what is going to happen. And Buddha said, don't even worry about it. Think about now, because whatever might happen afterwards is directly related to what I'm doing now. So that shift from otherworldliness to here and now is a major shift. The second one was from book worship to self-realization. That yes, books are important. Books can be helpful. Books help remove many of my doubts and questions. But simply reading books, no one becomes enlightened. So the emphasis is on direct experience, not simply on book worship. Third was a priestly domination to social equality, especially more so in earlier days. Nowadays, it's there, but it's been there in every generation. But the idea that some people should exploit others because of so-called their monopolizing or being custodians of that higher truth, and then exploiting others who didn't have access to it, that had got to stop. And that was that priestly domination that existed in every society, in every tradition, in every point in history. And what Buddha did was, it brought about this kind of a social equality, bringing religion to the doorstep of everyone. In the Indian subcontinent, many of these ancient texts were in Sanskrit. And so Sanskrit was the language of the elites. And so the common people who often didn't have access to that knowledge. And so what the Buddha did was, Buddha taught in the language of the people. Buddha didn't write any big philosophical treatises in Sanskrit. He just taught in the language of the people. He brought the truth to everyone. And finally, from the emphasis on individualism to a collective struggle, Buddha recognized that, yes, ultimately, when we go to sleep, we sleep alone. When we die alone. So yes, there is the individual dimension to our spiritual struggle. But Buddha also recognized that even though our struggles may be individual, when we struggle together, that there is a strength in doing it collectively. And so the idea of the Sangha, the idea of the spiritual community, which wasn't so much a part of the social life, the spiritual life in the Indian subcontinent during Buddha's time, the Buddha said, no, let's create this community. And so the emphasizing the support and help that a community can give to a person and what the person can contribute to the community. And that was one great shift that we find after the advent of Buddha. So there is a lot that we can talk and think about. It's a very rich tradition, almost 25 centuries, 2,500 years old. And so on days like this, at least once a year, perhaps a little more often, we'll have chance and opportunity to think about the great contributions that the Buddha has done to our understanding. We don't all have to become Buddhists to appreciate the greatness of Buddha. But what we find that the insights that he gave, the teachings that he gave, can enrich our life, no matter which might be, whatever might be our own principal form of practice ourselves. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. This Wednesday, instead of the Upanishad class, we have a guest, Swami Tyagananda, who is a head of our Vedanta Center in Fiji Islands. So he is visiting us this week, and he will speak on Wednesday evening on the subject, applying Vedanta to wellness. So I would encourage those of you who can come, please do come. It will be an interesting talk by Swami Tyagananda of Fiji Islands this Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. But this will not be streamed, so you will have to come here if you want to see that. On Tuesday and Saturday, our meditation will also continue as usual. And next Sunday, our subject will be overcoming loneliness. So you've got to come for that one. Otherwise, you'll be very lonely at home if you don't come. So let's conclude with a prayer. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Aura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.